For a while, our deans wouldn't even use the term grade inflation. They said, well, it's grade compression. Maybe our students are just getting better and better. And I knew that that was nonsense, having taught at Harvard for 23 years. So I looked at performance on the multiple choice portion of the final exam of the course that I've taught for 23 years. And what I found is they went down by 10 percentage points on a 100-point scale. So it certainly belies any suspicion that our students are getting better and better, because this suggests they're getting worse and worse.
My guest today is Steven Pinker, professor of psychology at Harvard University.
All right, Steve, I'm very excited for this conversation. Thank you for joining the Information Theory podcast. So today I wanted to talk to you about the Blank Slate, the book you wrote that was released in 2002. So in the book, you make the case that there is such a thing as human nature, which is in fact downstream of genetics. And you argue against the idea that humans are blank slates who are shaped entirely by culture and socialization. First of all, this blank slate idea, it kind of seems implausible on its face, but you make the case in the book that it was actually the prevailing view or the unspoken orthodoxy among intellectuals. Can you give us a sense of how that came to be and what the conditions were at the time that you wrote it?
Yeah, well, historically, it was a hugely influential idea in the 20th century, and it continues to be. And I argue that a lot of its appeal comes from moral and political and emotional considerations. There were historical facts that encouraged it. One of them was the discovery over the 19th century and then publicized in the early decades of the 20th century that there is variation among human cultures. These are discoveries from ethnography showing that many of our dietary and religious and sexual practices can vary across cultures. There was a desire for an antidote or a refutation of some of the pseudoscientific theories of race that were popular at the end of the 19th century, that the different races were separately evolved or separately created if you're of a religious bent. The idea that even within a race, that the Irish are inherently pugnacious and the Italians are jolly and musical and emotional. And so there was a desire, and there were facts that suggested that that crude kind of genetic determinism was false. But it spread into a dogma that we were blank slates, that babies were born just with a few reflexes. There were a few general purpose mechanisms of learning, like Pavlovian conditioning and instrumental or reward conditioning, that cultures and languages could vary without limit. One of the implications being that aspects of our current society that make us uncomfortable are changeable. If we just change the culture, change the parenting practices, change the media, change the educational system, then the features that we deplore can simply be erased out. They were historically contingent in the first place. It also struck people as the ultimate bulwark against racism and ethnic prejudice, because it was simply impossible that there could be innate racial or ethnic differences if there was no genetic structure to personality and intelligence in the first place. And some people thought that if our minds, our personalities bear the influence of our genes, in turn shaped by natural selection, that would absolve us of all responsibility for our actions. We could always say, it wasn't me, it was my genes. And maybe it would even drain life of all meaning and purpose if I'm just acting out the imperatives of my genes as opposed to choosing my life course. Anyway, the point of the book was to identify these non-scientific sources of the appeal of the blank slate. They themselves don't prove one way or another what is or is not innate, but they show that there has been a thumb on the scale, that there's been a huge desire to believe in the blank slate for political reasons, and that the science was compromised because people very much wanted the empirical outcome to be in a certain way. And this continues, you continue to see it. The book was republished with a new afterword in 2016. And it's relevant today because the influence of the blank slate is very much with us. Whenever you see a study, for example, showing that parents treat their kids in a certain way, or parents have certain traits and their kids end up in a particular way, therefore parenting or social class or upbringing is decisive, well, I mean, it might be, but until you rule out the possibility that the effects are due to shared genes between parents and children, you've come to a scientifically bogus conclusion. So the science itself often continues to be compromised by the assumption of the blank slate that genes couldn't possibly matter, so let's not even try testing for them.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So your claim is that people were very resistant to this idea that we are influenced by our genes, that we're not blank slates. They were resistant to this because of its kind of moral and political implications. And among them is kind of the fear of justifying inequality, or the fear of saying that our inequality is genetically determined.
Or in part, I mean, it wouldn't. That is, the influence is not zero.
Right. And so this orthodoxy became such that people went all the way in the other direction, and they basically said, we believe that we are blank slates, that the influence of genetics and innate biology is zero. So was it really that bad? Because it seems like such a crazy thing to believe. I mean, how did this orthodoxy actually feel like on the ground? Like, what was the acceptable range of things you could say about human nature as, in a faculty meeting or a dinner party, or somebody working in like a psychology lab in the 1990s?
Yeah, it was. By the 90s, it had gotten a bit better. Now I think it may have gotten worse. Well, just some examples. The idea that innate differences between the sexes, that there are innate differences between the sexes, was radioactive up to the point where, after the Blank Slate was published, the president of Harvard, Larry Summers, got into a maelstrom of attacks because he had speculated that some of the differences in the representation of women in STEM may not completely be due to biases and prejudices and hidden barriers, but due to innate differences in the profile of cognitive ability, talents, and life choices. So that was ragingly controversial. The idea that there are racial differences, which I don't go into in the book, and I don't go into it in general, is maybe the most radioactive topic in all of academia. But and that couldn't even exist if we were blank slates. Even the idea, though, that say looking at university admissions and the debate over whether objective testing like the SAT or the GRE ought to be used in admissions. People point to the fact that children of wealthier parents tend to do better in the SAT as a kind of proof that the SAT must be biased. It picks up on wealth and socioeconomic status rather than talent. Well, that argument depends on the assumption that parents don't pass on genes to their children. It ignores the possibility that smarter and more diligent parents tend to get higher paying jobs, that their kids may inherit some of these traits, and that's why the kids do well on the SAT. Now, again, we don't know whether that's true or not until we do the tests, but the dogma or the assumption not even worth examining, because it just seems to so many people to be self-evidently true, is that there is no heritability of psychological traits.
Yeah, I mean, all those things that you mentioned, I can see how they're politically touchy subjects, right? And people would be particularly motivated in those cases to pretend like they have this blank slate view, because in those particular cases, it could be seen as justifying inequality of some kind if they were to subscribe to the idea that things are downstream of genes. But what I'm wondering is, let's say you had a colleague who had just given birth to fraternal twins, and one of them is a boy, one of them is a girl. Are you saying that back in the 80s, that colleague would have been shocked had you gotten them a gift for each of the kids, and one was like a truck and one was a doll? Like, would that be totally taboo back then? Like, I just want to get a sense of, outside of these these politically charged topics, like what did people profess?
Yeah, I think that'd be taboo today. I mean, at least it depends on the social class, but among the educated people, that I think that would be taboo. I mean, I wouldn't do it if I had friends with opposite sex fraternal twins. But there is, though, your incredulity reflects a natural reaction that it's just so obvious that there are innate differences. There are sex differences. There are differences between individuals. Could people
to be clear, differences in average distributions?
Average. Oh, yes. We're always talking about averages. Two overlapping Gaussians, bell curves, meaning that you can't make a prediction about any individual based on the group that they belong to. But there is a certain amount of, I think, slippage between what people privately believe and what they're willing to share in intimate circles and what they publicly pronounce. And I happen to know that the same people who deny the existence of intelligence as a meaningful, measurable construct will happily gossip about those of their colleagues that they think aren't too bright and others who they think are brilliant. Likewise, people who would be publicly skeptical of the possibility of sex differences would be very quick just to call out some, preening, dominance-obsessed male as exhibiting typical male behavior, or some lascivious colleague as well. What do you expect from a guy? So in their private gossip and humor and wry observations, people acknowledge that there is such a thing as human nature and human differences. But we all know, and this is a topic of my more recent book, that there can be a big slippage between public and private pronouncements. And there can even be a case where people mistakenly believe that everyone else believes something when very few people actually believe it. Pluralistic ignorance is sometimes called, but this would get us off on a whole other discussion relevant to my book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, but on a different topic than The Blank Slate and Human Nature.
Yeah, I think you said you gave about 50 podcast interviews last year promoting that book. So I didn't want to talk too much about it, but obviously it's going to come up. But I wanted to walk through the specific scientific claims in The Blank Slate about what parents do and don't transmit to their kids. So I'm thinking specifically about chapter 19, which is titled Children. You've said that's your favorite chapter and actually one of the favorite things you've ever written. So I guess, first of all, can you introduce the 3 laws of behavioral genetics?
Yeah. So this was a chapter primarily about differences between people. A separate question from what is universal to human nature, how we differ from chimpanzees, what all cultures have in common. So those are discussed in other chapters. This one zeroed in on what makes 2 people from the same culture different. And it began with a summary of an enormous literature on behavioral genetics, highly robust and replicable, replicability, schmeplicability. This is one area of psychology that is truly replicable and robust. So much so that one behavioral geneticist, Eric Turkheimer, summarized the state of the art in 3 laws, which itself is rather audacious because psychology tends not to have laws. But these were replicable enough that he only partly tongue-in-cheek called them laws. So the first law is that all behavioral traits are heritable, partly heritable. That is, the correlations are greater than 0. The second law is that the effects of families are smaller than the effects of genes. I find this, 24 years later, an amazingly difficult concept for people to grasp. Well, actually, there are 2 concepts that are difficult to grasp. So when you say the first law, all traits are heritable, people are saying, oh, so you're saying it's all in the genes. Well, no, what it's saying is that some of the differences are in the genes. That is, that heritability estimate is greater than 0. But the second fallacy is to say, okay, you admit that it's nature and nurture, so part of what makes us different from others is our genome, and the other part is how we're brought up by our parents, what our house is like, what our neighborhood is like. But one of the beauty of behavioral genetics is it can distinguish 2 categories of non-genetic influence. One of them called the shared or familial environment, and that is what, say, 2 siblings in a house experience together. Are their parents strict or lax? Are they affectionate or cold? How many TVs are in the house? How many books? How many guns? And the second law of behavioral genetics is the effects of families are surprisingly small, often 0, at least when the child is grown up. Sometimes there are effects of the family environment when they're still kids, but they tend to peter out to very little or nothing. Then the third law of behavioral genetics is a consequence of the fact that heritability is less than 100%, and the second law, that effects of families approach 0%. And that is, there must be a source of influence of what we are that is neither genetic nor familial. Now, this is sometimes called the non-shared environment, on the assumption that everything that makes us what we are is determined either by genes or environment. So if it's not genes, by definition, it's environment. But it can encompass also random chance, random factors in the wiring of the brain as we develop, random life events that befall one sibling and not another, It could even include new mutations, genetic influences that are not estimated in heritability that affect one child but not another. But those account for whatever they are, all those accidents, random factors, unpredictable causes, account for a substantial amount of the variance, and they are neither familial nor genetic.
Yeah, so just to summarize the three laws of behavioral genetics. So the first one is that there is some non-zero degree of heritability, that the parent transmits traits to the child genetically. The second one is that the effect of shared environment, which is what the systematic influence of the parent is, common to their multiple children, is much smaller than that from the first law. And then the third law is kind of like, oh, there's all this stuff left over. We're not really sure what's going on. Maybe it's just idiosyncratic stuff that's going on. There could be any number of ways, this could happen.
Yes, so conventionally, it's often stated as the environment that one child in a home experiences that the other one doesn't. But that actually presupposes that there is such an environmental influence if there are purely random effects on development, whether neurodevelopmental or environmental, they would go into that term as well. Since the book came out, there is a proposed fourth law of behavioral genetics, proposed by my former student James Lee and others, which is that heritability arises from the combined effects of a large number of genes, each with a small effect, or else genes that have a measurable effect but that are extremely rare. So that is a refutation of the idea that was common in the 90s, that there's the gene for homosexuality or the gene for depression or the gene for anything else. There are not. And I was glad that when I wrote The Blank Slate, I resisted the temptation to trumpet those discoveries because they turned out not to be replicable and not typical of the way genes do influence behavioral traits.
So I think a classic example of the fourth law is just like you have all these genes of very small effect for height.
Yes.
And you might have a few that just by themselves cause dwarfism, but they're very rare.
Exactly right.
So I think the most surprising thing about the three laws is actually the second. There's a very specific range of values that you attribute to what's called shared environment. And it's possible that the effect of shared environment on outcomes is actually close to 0%.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very surprising. So in a way, you're saying what the parents do might have zero consequence for how their children turn out in terms of these behavioral traits. So, for example, in terms of their child's IQ or their child's measured neuroticism or something like that. Is that an accurate characterization?
Yes, with a couple of provisos. One is that there often are measurable effects while the child is still in the home and under their parents' thumbs, which it tends to dissipate by adulthood. The other is that this is excluding extreme cases. This comes from studies of large numbers of kids or adults in pretty much normal homes. So it excludes cases of extreme abuse or deprivation. Or at least we just don't know. But we're talking about the normal range. That two parents who might differ in their parenting style and their parenting philosophy and their personalities, that seems to have no lasting effect on intelligence or personality. And it is a surprise. It prompted a hugely controversial bestseller by Judith Rich Harris called The Nurture Assumption, that why parenting matters less than you think and peers matter more, and which is an influence on the children chapter in The Blank Slate.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, I still can't wrap my head around this idea, it is very surprising to me, the idea that parents don't matter at all in terms of these outcomes for their children.
Well, it matters for the genes they bequeath, of course.
Right.
Now, of course, there's some obvious exceptions. We're talking there about personality traits and intelligence. When it comes to something like, do you know how to ski? Well, if your parents gave you ski lessons, you're much more likely to grow up knowing how to ski. So particular skills could make a difference. But underlying traits, it seems not. And for that matter, in things that are unquestionably acquired, like the skills and norms of your culture, it shouldn't be so surprising that parents don't matter when you actually think of the crucial cases, which are from immigration. When you have kids whose parents come from one culture and are brought up in another culture, how do the kids end up? Well, they assimilate. They speak without an accent. even if their parents have thick accents. They they wear what their peers wear. They eat what their peers eat. They listen to the same music as their peers. Simply because the part of us that is that is what we call socialization consists of kids holding their own and competing well in their peer group. That's where their professional success is going to be determined. That's where they're going to find mates. And so kids have very finely tuned antennae for their peers' culture. And parents, they're perfectly happy to be fed and clothed by their parents, but they don't copy them when it comes to the skills of their culture.
Yeah, that part makes sense. But I'm just thinking about, as a parent, what can you do? I think it seems pretty self-evident that there are interventions that you can do to completely change the course of your child's kind of cognitive development, right? So you mentioned language. Like obviously, if a kid who's raised as an immigrant in a new culture kind of just soaks up all those norms and the new language, but as a parent, it's pretty simple for you to just raise them in your own language, and they end up being bilingual or trilingual. You mentioned
kids. No. That's actually not always the case. Children of immigrants often reject their parents' language, force their parents to speak to them in the language of the adopted country.
I mean, I think it depends on how stubborn the parent is versus the child.
But again,
right?
even then, though, we're talking about the content of acquired knowledge, the particular language that you speak, how fluent, how size of the vocabulary, literacy. Those we assume that parents have a big influence, but when you do the measurements and you do it with the proper genetic controls, that is, you don't allow yourself to be fooled by the confound that parents provide both in environment and genes, then you can often be surprised. So, and there are different ways of doing it. The most obvious one is look at adopted kids. How much do they resemble the parents who brought them up, or the siblings who shared a home? And the answer is not much. They actually resemble their biological siblings who they've never met more than their adoptive siblings who they grew up in the home with.
Right. I mean, so just thinking about kind of concrete scenarios, right? You mentioned skiing. Isn't it conceivable to you that if you raise a child and you kind of help them develop a mastery of something such as skiing, that they'll end up being more confident, or that their personality traits will meaningfully change? I mean, is that
their ability to ski will change. Whether their personality will change is not obvious to me, and I think the evidence suggests that it won't.
Right. So you're saying, specifically the kind of outputs that psychologists will measure are IQ tests and these big five traits of psychology, which are...
Well, not just those, also behavioral outcomes like probability of getting divorced, addicted, getting in trouble with the law, how many books you read, educational attainment, how much TV you watch, whether you smoke. All of those behavioral traits also are subject to the three laws. But kids pick their environments according to their innate traits, sometimes called gene-environment correlation. That is, the kid who is curious about ideas, if they don't get it from the home, they'll get it from their friends' homes. They're more likely to go to the library. They're more likely to get things from the internet. Kids who find reading a drag, find ideas boring, parents can give them all the books they want. They just won't get into them. So yes, when it comes to specific content, just in the obvious sense that no one has clairvoyance or ESP, you can't derive an idea unless you've been exposed to it somehow. But what we call traits, as opposed to content, seem to be, except in extreme cases, just both environment and perhaps genetic freaks. But otherwise, the three laws hold.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you would consider an extreme case, right? Like, what is the normal range of parenting styles? What would that include? Like, if you consider a standard suburban tiger mom, does that fall within the normal range? If you consider, these stories of how Serena Williams or Tiger Woods were brought up by their kind of like obsessive parents, right? Clearly, in those cases, there was some contribution from shared family environment.
Maybe, but unless we have the counterfactual of what would happen if they were brought up by other parents, would they? I mean, they could very well have gone into another sport, but would they have, since they had so much mastery in that one domain in life? Presumably, that would have awakened a desire just to get better at it, because people like to do things that they're good at. We don't know how far they would have proceeded if they had different parents, because plenty of world-class athletes did not have parents who were as obsessive as the Williams dad.
Yeah. I mean, definitely in the case of something like track and field, but I think those two particular sports, which are tennis and golf, they're very dependent on like early training with like specialized equipment that isn't widely
Yeah, so again,
available, right?
we're cycling back to the same point. That is, of course, content depends on necessary input, because kids don't have clairvoyance, they don't have ESP, but the underlying traits, athleticism, both talent and interest, probably related. Uh, we have it is very hard to find any effective parenting on that. Although
Right.
whether your parents give you opportunities in golf or tennis can make a difference. But again, we're going back to the same issue of content versus traits.
Yeah. So I want to move on to the evidence for these three laws, right? So I think a lot of the classical evidence rests on these three designs, experimental designs, which are twins reared apart, twins reared together, and adoption studies, right?
And now there's a fourth one of genome-wide association studies.
Right. Exactly. And some critics have argued that all of these have kind of structural weaknesses that tend to push heritability estimates upwards, and that might actually revise our estimates of what the second law would give as that number. So before we get into these specific methodological questions, how confident are you in the robustness of these models?
I'm pretty confident, because what you said wasn't quite accurate. What is true is that they all have weaknesses. What is not true is that they all have the same weaknesses. That is, they do compensate for each other's flaws, and the effects are just, especially by the standards of psychology, are amazingly robust. And hence the anointing of these patterns as laws.
Right. So I think one of the strands of evidence that's emerged since you've written your book are these genome-wide association studies, and so basically they find a bunch of places on the genome that seem to be associated with differences in outcomes, and then they calculate a score based on that, and then see how much that score predicts these outcomes, right? So there's like some sort of correlation, and my understanding is that the scores that they calculate for heritability are only on the order of like 20%, right? It's not as high as the 50% that would be the case from these twin studies.
Well, yes, but that's baked into the method. It can't duplicate what you get from the twin and adoption studies, simply because the twin and adoption studies look at the entire genome, including the rare variants, including the variants whose effects are too small to be picked up in a GWAS, whereas the GWAS can only pick up the genetic variants that are common enough to be tested and that have large enough effects to be detected. Again, depending on the size of the sample, which is why estimates, even for things like height, which are not controversial, the heritability estimates from the best GWAS are significantly below what you get from the classic methods. So if my parents had some mutations, and I'm the way I am, I'm a mutant because of what happened to my dad's spermatogenesis. That cannot be picked up in a GWAS, but it does affect who I am. And we have reason to believe that there are hundreds, thousands of them. Every generation, we inherit another 30 mutations. And unless some of them, by drift or selection, become common enough that they'll be picked up on a SNP chip, then they're invisible to GWAS. So but even then, the fact that the estimates of heritability from GWAS, as you mentioned, are well above zero, and the idea that the effects might be zero is by no means a straw man. I quote people from the 80s, including respected geneticists like Richard Lewontin, also highly political, said there's no evidence that would cause a reasonable person to believe that the heritability of intelligence is above zero. And, he said that, and he's flat wrong. He was flat wrong then, but now he's especially flat wrong. Likewise, all of the studies that are done without genetic controls for alleged effects of parenting depend on the assumption that heritability is zero, and the genome-wide association studies show that it is substantially above zero. But it's necessarily going to be below the estimates that you get from methods that don't care about how rare a gene is or how many of them there are.
Yeah, so then I want to talk about the potential weaknesses of those methods that give pretty high estimates of heritability. So like specifically, there are these twins reared apart studies where they have twins who are kind of separated at birth and given to separate families to be adopted. And so the finding is that these twins end up remarkably similar to each other when they're later found and then tested on these measures. I think this idea of twins reared apart is very appealing, right? Because this is a very clean experimental design. We have these people who are genetically identical, and then they have a completely different environment. But one of the criticisms that I've read is that, in fact, a lot of these twins were not completely reared apart. And, at the very least, you have to account for the fact that they share the same womb, which means that they could have been susceptible to things like their mothers smoking or drinking while they were in the womb. And that would really, that would create some outliers that really, really push up and bias up the estimates of heritability, right? There's also the issue that a lot of these twins, they weren't literally adopted, from the hospital after labor, right? They spent a significant amount of time together in the same household, maybe up to the age of 5, and some incident caused them to be adopted later, and maybe that incident itself is going to bias the estimates of heritability upward. Are those things accounted for in?
Oh yes, I mean those criticisms have been around since the first publication of the major studies of twins reared apart, and they were refuted decades ago. So a few things: sharing a womb doesn't necessarily make twins more similar. It makes them more different because they compete over placental real estate. And so even more so for identical twins who often have to compete over a chorion and a placenta. The idea that it is rare that twins are separated at the age of 5. Granted, they might be separated at the age of a few months, but there is no reason to believe that those few months can actually make kids more similar in IQ. In any case, the studies measure the amount of time that they've spent together before being separated, and they show that they have no effect on the size of the correlation. Occasionally the idea that twins, when they may have met up and had a coffee together at the age of 20, and that would affect their IQ scores at the age of 40 is pretty fanciful. But again, in any case, if you actually measure how many contacts the twins had before they were tested in adulthood, it does not correlate with how similar they are. And finally, if all you had were identical twins separated at birth, you might say, well, the reason that they're similar is because they shared all these experiences. But the correlations are way, way higher for fraternal twins separated at birth, who share only half their genes and also are subject to the same placement effects, the same early effects, if there are any. And the difference between identical twins reared apart and fraternal twins reared apart is similar to the difference between identical twins reared together and fraternal twins reared together. And indeed, if you look at the estimates of heritability, there are several ways of estimating them, but two of the main ones are look at the difference between identical twins correlations and fraternal twins correlations, or just look at the simple correlation between identical twins reared apart. And those estimates are almost on the nose the same for probably about 50 different traits that have been tested. So yes, there are, one must bring up the criticism of these particular methods, but they have been accounted for in the studies of twins reared apart, and they give the same estimates for other techniques that don't depend on the assumptions of the twins reared apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it seems like there's a lot of different lines of evidence, and in your view, they all converge towards supporting this idea that, the second law, which is that parental.
The three laws really. Although not all the GWAS, I don't think can give you a measure of the relevant to the second law. That is, it can estimate heritability. I don't think it can estimate shared environment, but the other three techniques can.
So, on the topic of childhood development, you've studied language acquisition in children, and I think you've written or said that children acquire 60,000 words by the age of 18, which works out to one word every 2 waking hours. So that's a pretty crazy statistic. What does that say about kind of the way that the brain processes language?
Well, I have a book called Words and Rules: The Ingredients of Language. I could have titled it Memory and Computation. But it's the ingredients of language, or at least the architecture of language. But it suggests that there are two components to our prodigious language skill. One is that we do have a capacity for massive numbers of words, each of them an arbitrary conventional pairing between a sound and a meaning. Then we also have the ability to combine them in novel phrases and sentences where the meaning of the combination can be predicted from the meaning of the individual words and the way that they're combined. And I've suggested in that book that those are two gifts, both of which are worthy of respect and awe, and which together make language as powerful as it is.
You've also written about the idea that there's, or you've done research about kind of this idea of a crucial period or a critical period for language acquisition, which is that there's a window in development where the brain is especially primed for language, and then beyond that point, it becomes impossible or at least much harder to.
More difficult, yeah. I wouldn't say impossible, yeah. This is work that I did with Joshua Hartshorn and Josh Tenenbaum, and it pertains not to accent, that is phonology, which is probably even has a shorter and more circumscribed critical window. But we did this online in responses to a written questionnaire, so we were unable to test for age effects of accent. But this came from almost by accident, where Josh Hartshorn posted an online quiz to identify your dialect. Now, it's completely unclear to me why people would have to take a quiz to identify their dialect, because they know where they were born and where they grew up. But anyway, it went viral. We got, within a short period of time, 2/3 people filled it out. And they also filled out, many of them were spoke English as a second language, and they indicated both the age at which they began to learn English and how many years they were at it. So did they learn from birth? Were they in a bilingual household? Did they start when they were 2, when they were 5, when they were 15? And then that plus their current age allows you to determine how many years of practice they've had. Some people may have started learning English at 30 and now they're 40. Some people may have started from birth and now they're 10. And so we could more or less independently look at age at which they began and number of years of practice. And we found that there were effects of both. I mean, obviously not surprising that there are effects of amount of experience, but we found that there was an effect of age that if you start to learn a second language after around puberty, then you are worse on average. Although that doesn't mean that the underlying ability starts to atrophy at that time, because if you begin later, it also means on average you've had less experience. You got a late start. When we did a little bit of math modeling to try to decompose number of years of practice with age at onset, we found that the best estimate of the underlying change was surprisingly late, more like 16 or 17 years of age. And that was a novel finding. We weren't prepared for it. The field wasn't prepared for it.
So this is, what was the outcome being measured? So this was not accent, right? This was...
No, this was, it was a heterogeneous set of 100 items of vocabulary and grammar and idioms and interpretation. We were not able to zero in on which aspect of language starts to deteriorate. It's kind of an amalgam of all of them. All of them that go into processing of written language.
Right. So then concretely, if I wanted to figure out how hard would it be for me to learn a second language if I'm, say like 20 versus 30 versus 40. Could you give like a rule of thumb for like it becomes this much harder at this age relative to had you started when you were within the critical period?
Well, it as best we can tell, holding number of years constant. So if you look at how good you are, to say 20 years in, then it doesn't make much of a difference between birth and about 17, but then it declines after 17. Now,
Right.
however, you'll see a decline if you start even after 12 or 13, simply because you've had 10 or 12 fewer years of practice. If we try to decompose them, we found this is estimated indirectly, that the decline seems to start around 17, decline in the underlying ability.
So if you had to speculate, is that an innate biological thing? Is that something like neurological pruning, or is it just a matter of people's motivation or like cultural kind of environment changing as they age?
Yeah, and the answer is we don't know. It's possible. It's not the obvious age at which you'd expect a neurobiological change to have an effect, such as say puberty or two. But we do know that there are changes in the brain in late adolescence, including maturation of the frontal lobes, myelinization of the frontal lobes in particular. But that we don't have, our data are not granular enough to allow us to answer that question. Personally, my hunch is that it is something biological, but I don't have evidence. We don't have evidence for that.
Yeah, I'm really curious about this because I had a previous guest who's actually, he's learned something like 15 languages, and maybe half of those he picked up after puberty. And I'm just wondering, is he some sort of neurological freak, or is he just especially motivated and has figured out the right set of kind of ensemble of learning strategies to overcome?
Yeah, so the answer is we don't know. So well, certainly if it was after puberty but before say 17, then he's firing on all 8 cylinders. So wouldn't expect a decrement. There's reason to believe that earlier languages having established a base layer of languages equips you to learn further ones, so that certainly a first language helps you learn a second one. And we know that from studies of deaf kids who may not have sufficiently acquired a first language by the time they learn a signed language. But it's also possible that either innate ability or motivation or both made a difference in his case. In fact, it's got to be some combination, because most people don't learn that many languages that late.
Right. So I want to talk about something else, which is you've become one of the most prominent voices for the idea that if you zoom out and you look at long run data, you can see that humanity has become, humanity has been on a remarkably positive trajectory over a timescale of centuries. And you've written actually 2 books about how things like violence, poverty, infant mortality, literacy, they've all been improving over time and at various timescales. And you've actually taken a lot of heat for saying that, but it seems like all your claims have been backed up with charts and tables of historical data. So recently, Harvard published its own long-run data trend, which was the share of grades that students receive that are A's have gone up from 24% in 2005 to over 60% last year.
Yes.
In fact, they're considering introducing A pluses. Is this a good example of the kind of progress that you've been talking about?
And I've spoken out about that we had to do something about grade inflation. And in fact, a report just came out a few days ago, a recommendation from a committee that the number of A grades be capped at 20% of a class plus a constant of 4 in order to do something about it. And I've got to emphasize that the idea that the human condition has improved over long stretches of time doesn't mean that everything gets better for everyone everywhere all the time. As I said, that would be progress. That would be a miracle, and progress is not a miracle.
So you're saying your students aren't just getting that much better? They're not just all suddenly deserving of A's?
So I looked at that, because for a while our deans wouldn't even use the term grade inflation. They said, "Oh, it's grade compression. Maybe our students are just getting better and better." And I knew that was nonsense, having taught at Harvard for now for 23 years. So I looked at the a pretty constant yardstick, which is the performance on the multiple choice portion of the final exam of the course that I've taught for 23 years, my intro psych course, where, the questions turn over, but I think the difficulty remains pretty constant. And what I found is they went down. They did not go up. Now my 10 percentage points on a 100-point scale. Now, the social scientist in me has to rule out alternative explanations, and it's possible that duller students have been taking psychology over the years, and the composition of the class has changed. I don't think so.
Hold on, 10% over
10 percentage points.
10 percentage points
over 20 years, yeah.
Well, that's a very large effect.
It is. It certainly belies any suspicion that our students are getting better and better, because this suggests they're getting worse and worse. The reason I don't think it's just because of a change in sampling, it's possible, but is that it comports with other indicators, such as we know that students are reading less over the years. They spend less time on coursework than they used to. And I sense from my course evaluations that students complain about the amount of reading, which has not changed over the decades, but they're increasingly likely to complain about reading. So there are expectations that there be less reading, less engagement with content. It's also consistent with another trend that has not been, at least in the last 20 years, has been going in the wrong direction, which is the Flynn effect, the secular rise in IQ scores over the 20th century has been, at least in the countries where it's been going on the longest, has turned a corner and now has been in decline. It hasn't wiped out the advances of the 20th century, but the upward progress, it flattened out as it would have to. Things that can't go on forever don't, and people couldn't just keep getting higher and higher scores on IQ tests for indefinitely. But it's actually going downward. The IQs.
It's going in the opposite direction. It's going downward.
Yeah, in the last couple of decades. Yeah, at least in regions like Scandinavia and the United States. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really surprising to me. Obviously, I was being glib about the kind of positive trajectory of history, but you would think that every year more and more students compete for kind of the same limited number of spots, and Harvard has its pick of the best and brightest. So it's pretty shocking to me to hear that they've lost 10 percentage points in this kind of.
Yeah. So it's not that Harvard has gotten less selective over that time, but the culture as a whole, the expectations of students as to how much work and thought to put into courses seems to have declined. At least, again, with the asterisk that these are the course students who take in psychological science, and it may be that it's a different pool than it used to. Right.
So earlier in our conversation, you mentioned this, controversy with Larry Summers. And so, I want to talk about controversies in general. So you strike me as unusually rational, polite, calm. You don't seem like the kind of person who enjoys getting into fights.
Yeah, not particularly, no.
And you don't strike me as kind of like a Larry David figure either, right? You're not going to go into like a dinner party and, just have this urge to blurt something out that you're not supposed to say.
Quite the opposite. I'm a polite Canadian.
Yeah, that's right. And yet, again and again, you step into these highly contentious debates on free speech, academic freedom, campus politics. What I'm curious about is, why does it feel like you're such a singular person in that role? I think a lot of professors would probably agree with you on a lot of things privately, and a lot of them even have tenure. But the question is, why do so few speak publicly the way that you do? And maybe, we can talk about the Larry Summers incident as an example of that.
Yeah, so I think tenure has made a difference. Although tenure itself, it ought to be examined. It's a long-standing academic custom, and it may not be the best way to promote free inquiry, free speech, intellectual diversity. But I think it does help, and certainly in my case, if I had a rolling 5-year contract, I think I would have played it safer in terms of exploring ideas, knowing that I'd be evaluated by my peers, and who knows which peers. So it has emboldened me. From my point of view, as you note, I don't like stirring things up. I don't like causing controversy. I do like, in when I think of our interesting ideas that are insufficiently, at least by my lights, appreciated. That is, interesting findings that are that ought to be taken into account. I suppose I wouldn't devote my energy to communicating them if everyone already believed them. So there is some selection for controversy, just in the fact that I find some ideas interesting and worth expressing. That's probably going to select for controversy.
Yeah, so you're saying you care so much about ideas that it's more important for you to make sure that the ones that you see as correct win out uh, at the cost of some personal controversy that you have to endure.
Yeah, and also I think I feel that my marginal contribution to intellectual life uh, would be in not repeating the conventional wisdom, but stirring up the pot of ideas. Now I don't do that just. I actually I manage my controversy portfolio, so I don't take on you know every outrage, every shocking idea. I do concentrate on ones where I think that the case is good. That is, I can back it up with evidence. So I'm not a firebrand. I choose topics where I feel comfortable making the argument based on data.
Yeah, so if you're kind of self-consciously managing your controversy portfolio, has there ever been a time where you thought you kind of feel like, oh, I didn't see that coming, like this thing has become incredibly controversial and I didn't even try to set out to do it?
Well, one example would be in my book, How the Mind Works. I devoted the final chapter to a number, I called it facetiously, the meaning of life, where I turned to some of our higher pursuits: literature, art, music, humor, and wit, uh, religion, philosophy. And much of the book argued that some of our psychological faculties were Darwinian adaptations: fear, disgust, and episodic memory, language, um, sexual jealousy, but partly to reinforce the point that not everything is a Darwinian adaptation. It's not. It shouldn't be used circularly. That is, well, if we see it, it must have evolved, because if it hadn't evolved, we wouldn't see it. Um, but also because there are many things that people do where it's just completely unclear how it would have enhanced reproductive fitness in a ancestral environment. And music being one of them, I've never seen a good argument that music is a um, evolutionary adaptation in the technical sense of a trait which, in the environment our ancestors evolved in, uh, resulted in them having more surviving babies. And so I suggested that music was a byproduct of language, of the auditory system, of emotional calls, of motor control. Uh, that turned out to be, I don't know, it might be the most controversial thing I've ever said. Maybe because I rather tactlessly used an analogy where I said, people nowadays like cheesecake. It doesn't mean we evolved with a taste for cheesecake. It just means we evolved the taste for sweets and creamy fats. We're a smart species. One of the things that we apply our intelligence to do is to concentrate and purify uh, environmental stimuli to give us a massive jolt of pleasure. We like, we have pleasure technologies, things that we engineer just to make us feel good. Uh, Cheesecake being an example, and maybe music is another. That is, there are features of the auditory world that give us pleasure, and music concentrates them. Uh, so that didn't go over well. What, you think music is junk food like cheesecake, and it's so frivolous? Music is so uplifting, and it bonds us, and it gives us meaning. And anyway, I think most of the responses were misunderstandings, partly just what evolutionary adaptation is. It's not something that is good or healthy or valuable. Quite the opposite. I think a lot of evolutionary adaptations are rather nasty, and a lot of the things that uh, we should be most proud of are not Darwinian adaptations, music being an example. But that that turns out to be flamingly controversial.
Getting back to the idea of controversy in general, do you have a theory about why more of your tenured colleagues don't, step forward and engage in controversies? Do you think academia has become more conformist over time, or do people simply stopped believing in free speech as a principle?
Yeah, I think some of both. I don't want to romanticize academia in the 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, but we are social creatures. We respond to um, praise, blame, admiration, condemnation. And once you do have tenure, the upside is you don't have to worry about being fired for the content of your opinion. Actually, that's not totally true. Some people still are, but it makes it harder to fire someone. The downside is that you, you there's no longer an incentive structure to be original, to introduce new ideas. You can coast on what got you tenure in the first place.
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about artificial intelligence. So you mentioned the book Words and Rules, and actually, I think that specific book was your response to something that was happening in kind of the academic literature. My understanding is back in the 1970s, 80s, cognitive scientists assumed that the mind worked like a symbolic system, something like software running in the brain. So this idea that language is software running in the brain, it was challenged in the 80s when by these so-called connectionists, and then there was this book, Parallel Distributed Processing, which presented a kind of early neural network model that showed, you could do certain things with a neural network that were surprising, and maybe the connectionists were saying this is kind of evidence that that is what cognition is, right? If you can produce language using these neural networks, then it kind of falsifies this view that we're just running a symbolic rule system in our brain. So you came out with you pushed back strongly against that. You had a paper in 1988, and then that became Words and Rules. So could you expand on that? Like, what was the core disagreement between what you were proposing and what the connectionists were proposing, and what exactly were people arguing about?
Yeah, so this is a debate that actually went kind of in cycles. That in the late 40s and 50s, there were primitive neural network models. D.O. Hebb, the famous Canadian psychologist at my alma mater, McGill, proposed the idea of cell assemblies, the Hebb learning rule, where behavior and intelligence was explained with these neural networks, these artificial neural networks. And there were models of perceptrons, pandemonium, up through the early 60s. But it was challenged starting in the mid-50s by Herb Simon, Alan Newell, Marvin Minsky, Noam Chomsky, George Miller, who, influenced by recursive function theory from mathematics, the development of the digital computer, information theory from Shannon and Weaver, proposed that the human mind was a symbol processing system, that there were propositions, there were production rules that would move symbols around, and that's what intelligence consisted of. Then you're right that there was a revival in the 1980s of the neural network models called connectionism or parallel distributed processing, and that seminal volume that you referred to, which had contribution by Geoffrey Hinton, who since then has won a Nobel Prize for his contributions to modern neural networks. One of the empirical phenomena that became a focus for the question of how the mind worked, what was the computational architecture of the mind? Was it a neural network? Did it process symbols? Or was it some hybrid, what today we call neurosymbolic models? That term didn't exist in the 80s, 90s, and when I was researching this. But anyway, one of the empirical phenomena that was kind of a test case was just the formation of the simple English past tense. You add ed to a verb, and you get the past tense: walk, walked, played, played, believed, believed, and so on. And partly because starting in the late 50s, this was considered a textbook case of a rule of language, a symbolic operation, as manifest by the fact that kids, when they were 4, could be given a brand new verb, like, here's a man who knows how to wug. They could say, well, yesterday he wugged, even if they hadn't heard it before, so they weren't simply memorizing that set of tokens, but must have productively combined them. And they spontaneously make errors like breaked and sticked and teared and holded, which also they could not have acquired from their parents, but must have consisted of the over-application of this symbolic rule. Jay McClelland and David Rummelhart came up with a simple neural network model that seemed to do the same thing, make errors like sticked and teared, and had some ability to generalize to new forms. And that was one of the things that kind of kicked off the debate through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s that I never argued that all cognition was simple processing. By no means. I argued for what we would now call neurosymbolic, namely that we have an associative memory that can generalize by similarity to graded cases, but we also have an ability to combine symbols. And that also is involved in cognitive processes like understanding the structure of sentences, maintaining a model of the world, understanding what's true and what's false, even if it's atypical. So it then went into kind of abeyance by the late 90s, early 2000s, when the limitations of neural network models became apparent. So it was a fad that kind of died out until the great AI awakening of the 2010s, where through sheer scale, that is the co-opting of GPUs to neural network models so that you could have not just one hidden layer or two hidden layers, but 50, 60, 70 hidden layers that were computationally tractable, and the availability of gargantuan training sets, namely the World Wide Web, as opposed to, say, a corpus of Wall Street Journal for a year, just an entire different order of magnitude. To the surprise of a lot of people, they were a lot smarter than the neural network models of the 80s and the 90s, and that gave us the AI revolution, culminating in the generation of generative AI models, such as the large language models. Now, the debate, though, has kind of reoccurred, not coincidentally, because one of my collaborators, originally a student at the time, was Gary Marcus. He was my grad student at MIT. We published a number of papers together, and he has adapted some of the ideas that we developed then for what are the inherent limitations of neural network models, such as their tendency to hallucinate, their difficulty with out-of-sample examples, their liability to catastrophic interference, just baked into their architecture. When all you're doing is amalgamating large numbers of statistical associations, but you don't actually have any propositions of what is true and what is false, of what else, you don't have any mental model of things and places and causes, then there are bound to be limitations in what you can accomplish, even with these gargantuan training sets and huge numbers of parameters making up for the limitations of the architecture. So that's an ongoing debate, and Gary and Judea Pearl, and increasingly some of the pioneers of the large language models like Jan LeCun are arguing that the massively deep neural network models may have to be supplemented by world models, by symbolic processing, hence neurosymbolic models. So yes, words and rules. The words was the neuro, the rules was the symbolic.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you're saying is even though these modern LLMs have been incredibly successful at kind of impressing us, they aren't necessarily like a vindication of these connectionist arguments that were put forth in the 80s.
Yeah, I would say it would be premature to call them vindications. That they are undoubtedly more impressive than and probably anyone would have predicted. But the questions are, especially as a psychologist, I mean, putting aside the engineering question of how intelligent they are, how reliable they are, how trustworthy they are, how dangerous they are, there's the psychological question: do they explain what's happening in the human brain? And that's a separate question, not unrelated. Until the great AI awakening, we could, I thought we could rule them out simply because they were just too dumb. They just couldn't do things like understand a sentence, which humans can do. Now it's clear that they can understand sentences, so it can't be that line of argument. I would not press that argument anymore. However, there are questions of, is the amount of training that they require, namely what would the equivalent of if a child were trained like ChatGPT, they would need 30 million years of hearing sentences. Clearly, kids are talking after 18 months. Also, the combination, particular profile of brilliance and stupidity means that it isn't just a question of are they as smart as us, are they smarter than us. They may be a kind of a new form of alien intelligence that overlaps a lot of what people do, but not necessarily for the same reasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the general thing about it, I'm just wondering, is has the success of these large language models shifted how linguists or cognitive scientists, how they think about the nature of language or cognition in general?
It's certainly shifted how I think about it. I think I'm more receptive to the neuro side of the neurosymbolic divide, but kind of open-minded pending how much they depend on completely unrealistic training regimes.
Hmm. So it's not even about the what they're able to output. It's just how much training they
Well,
require.
so I think they're in asking the scientific, empirical, psychological question: is the human brain a large language model? One issue is, can large language models do what brains can do? The answer is, to a large extent, yes. But then there are other questions that, in evaluating the full panoply of evidence, do they learn in the same amount of time the kids do, from the same kinds of input? Do they make the same kinds of errors? Um, do they take the same amount of time? And so it's that full set of bodies of evidence, which hasn't completely been evaluated yet because there's just so much about these models that we don't know. What's the least amount of training that you could get away with? And another set of questions is, how much are they innately optimized for language in built-in hardware like the attention heads, which may be adaptations to the fact that a lot of dependencies in language are non-local. That is, your choice of word, 17 words into a sentence might depend on words number 2 and 3, so you might have to be able to look across big spans. That's hardwired into the network that they can do that. The fact that the regularities of language are not in sequences of words, but much higher order abstract patterns of nouns and verbs, which can get abstracted in these many hidden layers. Again, those are hardwired in, presumably as an adaptation to the fact that language is not a question of word by word by word, but much more abstract categories. The fact that the input isn't even the words themselves, but the so-called embeddings, the vectors of contexts that each word can appear in, which is a way of coding their semantics. Again, an acknowledgement of the fact that a lot of language depends not on just the tokens, but on their meanings. So another whole set of investigations is the models were done for engineering purposes, just to get the job done, and a lot of design choices went into them. How many of them are basically slipping in innate adaptations to language in their very architecture?
Mm. All right, Steve, my final question. What is your next book going to be about? Or if you don't know, what are you working on right now?
Yeah, not clear, but since a frequently asked question is what has happened to all of those curves of demonstrating human progress. Have they gone backwards? Are they continuing? And so one possibility is a book on the nature of progress in the 21st century, but there might be others.
Yeah, I would look forward to that, and I'd be really curious to hear how you've revised your views in light of all the crazy stuff that's been going on.
Okay, whole other conversation.
All right, thanks, Steve.
Thanks for having me.